She writes, Fictionistas have their say. Panelists are Geeta Avramundan, Radhika Jha and Gayatri Balas Panda. And the session will be moderated by Nirupama Dutt. Geeta Aravamuddin has worked as a journalist with Hindustan Times and Indian Express. Her latest book is Baby Makers, the story of Indian surrogacy. Her other books are Color of Gold, Disappearing Daughters, the tragedy of female feticide, Unborn Indian Women at Work, and The Healing. Radhika Jha is the author of Smell, The Elephant and the Maruti, and My Beautiful Shadow. She has worked for Hindustan Times and Business World, writing on culture, environment, and economy. She has also worked for the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation, where she started up a project for the education of children of victims of terrorism in different parts of India. Gayatri Bala Panda has published 7 collections of poems and had her poems translated into Hindi, named Dhoop Ka Rang. She is Central Sahitya Academy first Yuva Puraskar winner, Uriya. She has also won State Youth Award for Poetry, Rajiv Gandhi Sadbhavna Award, and Utkal Sahitya Samaj Yuva Kavi Samman. Nirupama Dutt from Chandigarh is a poet, journalist, literary and art critic, translator, and writes in Punjabi and English. She received the Punjabi Academy Award for her anthology of poems, Ek Nadi Swanhali Jahi. Her poetry anthologies have also come out in English and Hindi. Her translations include Stories of the Soil and The Poet of the Resolution. She has written the biography of a Dalit activist and singer called The Ballad of Bant Singh. Now, it's a proud moment for us. We will be having a book launch session. The book is written by Geeta Aravamundan, and I request so to come. It is a book on narrative journalism and is based on 2 years of research and is written in the fictionalized style. This is the first subject on which the intensive field work and research has been done.
Ma'am, come closer. Okay, okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I request Ms. Nirupama Dutt to carry forward with the session.
It is a wonderful afternoon. Um, we begin with the release of Baby Makers by Geeta Arvandam. And it is a happy moment also that one is sitting with 3 fiction writers. Uh, and as the topic of the session goes, fictionistas say it all. Well, women are probably the most natural storytellers. You know, they can tell a story. In fact, once in the course of an interview with U.R. Anantmurthy and asking about his sources, so he said, I would hang out in the kitchen listening to the tales of women. That was my source, kitchen tales and such stories. So women have this capacity to relate a story very easily. And 2 women meet in a train, and within 5 minutes, they have exchanged, the major theme of the stories of their lives. So here we are with 3 writers who have written books their own special way. And I thought we'll begin the session with a passage each, reading by them, and then go on to discussion and then questions. I would first request Geeta to read a passage from her book, Baby Makers, which is exercise of narrative fiction. She's been a journalist all her life, but she's written non-fiction, fiction, and this is narrative fiction. I request her to please read a short passage from the book.
Like Nirupama said, this is a book of narrative journalism. It's based on my journalistic experiences, but although the stories are all based on fact, I have narrated them in the form of fiction. not in the form of fiction, in a fictional style, in order to communicate better with my readers. So the book contains a lot of passages which almost look like they come out of stories. So I shall read one of these passages. This is one of the most popular passages in my book, I find, because a couple of magazines have also picked it up and published it. Plus, I find that a lot of people have found it quite amusing. This is Meena, and she's, kind of hired a surrogate. She comes from a South Indian Brahmin family, and she's now hired a Punjabi Christian as her surrogate. And she's worried whether to tell her parents-in-law that she's actually hired a surrogate, or to pretend as if the baby is her own. So she's still going through this whole lot of dilemma. So she says, suddenly the surrogate tells her that she was, when she asks the surrogate, Alice, are you all right? Alice says, I had morning sickness, but otherwise I'm all right. So it's the first time she's thinking that the woman who's actually going to carry her baby actually can go through morning sickness. She never thought of it like that, She just thought of her as almost like a box which was going to carry her baby. So then she suddenly realizes that the surrogate is a person. Now she has to decide whether she wants to pretend as if she's going to have the baby herself, or whether she's going to just tell her mother-in-law. Meanwhile, what has happened is she has found out that there are people who make artificial bellies, pregnancy bellies, which you can strap on if you want to pretend that you are pregnant. So the business of baby making has gone to such an extent that you can even buy an artificial belly. Back home, she rummaged through her suitcase and pulled out some brochures on prosthetic bellies. She had to decide very soon whether she wanted to use a fake belly or not. As soon as she lives in the UK actually. As soon as she got back to the UK after hiring her surrogate, she had started looking for prosthetic bellies. She hadn't decided whether to tell her in-laws about the surrogate or not. What if they totally freaked out? Anyway, until you decide, you do your homework and be prepared, Radha had said. Radha is her doctor and her friend. There are some women who want to fake it as they don't want their families to know. I can give you the contacts of some fake belly makers, and you can check them out. The bellies marketed by an online UK store, Radha suggested, looked quite solid and lifelike. Their website had an exhaustive and enlightening FAQs, frequently asked questions section. She hadn't given a thought to how her belly would be strapped on, or how she would go to the toilet with her belly on. Apparently, the fake bellies were made of silicone and were actually specially designed baby suits. They had bra cups and shoulder straps and an attachment at the bottom which could be taken apart when one needed to go to the toilet. The bump itself was made out of special rubber with a foam core to make it light. The back of the bump was curved to sit comfortably on the body of the wearer. The manufacturers had certain standard sizes, 4, 6, and 9-month bellies. Although different sizes could be also ordered online. There were also charts indicating what type of belly would suit a person of a specific weight and height. The skin color could be matched if required. The cost of the fake bellies varied according to the texture and size. So obviously, belly makers had given it all a lot of thought. But what she found most amusing was the piece about belly maintenance. The questions that are frequently asked were, if the silicone tummy is too shiny, what can I do? A small amount of talcum powder can be applied to the surface of the belly to dull it. This will also prevent fluff from sticking on it. Some of the edges of my silicone fake pregnant belly are uneven. Or there are faint marks or bubbles in the silicone fabric. Is this normal? So questions like this, how can I clean my fake belly? It can be either hand washed or cleaned with a mild detergent. So after going through all this, she also learnt about another woman in Ahmedabad who makes also fake bellies. But these were much cheaper, because here, for a cost of 1,000 rupees, she could get 3 bellies, simulating 3 months, 3, 5, and 7 months pregnancies. Whereas the fake UK bellies cost, anything up to 1,000 pounds. So she decides, she thinks maybe she should go in for an Indian belly. See, this is how even surrogacy is decided. Surrogates in India are much cheaper. So maybe we should go for an Indian surrogate rather than for a surrogate in some other country. So anyway, she decides that she is not going to go in for a fake belly, and that she will actually tell her in-laws and take the consequences of knowing that they can approve or not approve, but that is going to be her baby. So this is, I think that should do, no? So this is one piece from my book.
That was a beautiful piece, Geeta. I now request Radhika to please read a piece from her book, My Beautiful Shadow, a book set in Japan. Radhika will tell you a little more about it.
Hello, I'm Radhika Jha, and this is my 4th book. My first book was called Smell and was written, came out in 2000. I started writing it in 1997. This book is, My Beautiful Shadow, is about a woman who falls in love with beauty, who falls in love with not other people's beauty, but she falls in love with the beauty that she can create on her own body, which is the beauty that you create with clothes. And so it's the story of an addiction, and about how this woman becomes addicted to shopping, to wearing new clothes, because that is what makes her feel that she is visible, that she is noticed. And the way that this story began, I just wanted to share that with you, because people always ask me why this subject, it's such a frivolous subject. And I think that it is not actually a frivolous subject at all, because it is about one's identity, and it's about feeling insecure and not feeling like your life is complete. And I lived in Japan for 6 years, and I was lying in bed one night, and I was half asleep, and I had a dream. And in this dream, I saw this Japanese family, and they were going away for a holiday somewhere. There were 2 children and a father and a mother, and the mother was frantically getting all the stuff together, shutting the lights, getting the baggage together, and she was putting everything into the car, and she was getting everybody in there. And then the door shuts, and the car drove off, and then suddenly I was seeing the inside of the house, and I realized that this woman had not left, that she was in the house, and that the others had gone on the holiday. And at the same time, I also knew in this dream that the other people, the rest of her family, did not realize that she was not in the car. And I thought, wow, that's really very strange. And I realized that the reason they didn't notice that she was not in the car was that because she had become invisible to them. She was simply the one who provided and who took care of everything and who managed everything, but she had completely wiped out her own identity. And so this dream fascinated me, and at the same time it was about a Japanese woman. So for about a year I didn't want to touch it, because I said, what can I say, what can I write, and how can I dare to even write about Japan and Japanese women, etc. But in the end I decided to do it, because I thought that this is actually a universal theme, and it's something that needed to be talked about. It could have been set anywhere else, but I think in Japan you really see the struggle of traditional culture and a modern culture, very highly technologically advanced culture, and the kind of stress that it puts on the family, within the family, and how it can, destroy certain people who exist only within the family, because it's always valorizing what you do outside the family. Modern society tends to valorize your role outside, not so much inside. So this woman decides to resist this becoming invisible through shopping. And I'll just read a bit of the first chapter. My beautiful shadow. I have a secret. I belong to a club. You can see its members everywhere, in Ginza, in Marunouchi, in Aoyama and Omotesando, all the very best addresses in town. It's a very big club, easily the biggest in Tokyo, in Japan, maybe even in the world. But it's not a famous club. You don't have to fill any forms to join it. It doesn't have a dress code or a rule book, not even a name. And it also has no entrance fees. Though the expenses you might incur to remain a member would probably dwarf the fees of the most exclusive golf club. And there's no age limit for joining. It just takes a little time to get accepted. Actually, it is the club that is secret. It is secret in the sense that its members do not know each other. We see each other. We grow to recognize each other. On occasion, we even smile at each other, but we don't try to get to know each other. That's one of the unwritten rules. Belonging to a club is very different from belonging to a group. Everyone is born into a group. You are a man and I am a woman. You are American, I am Japanese. We did not decide this. It was decided for us. We were not given a choice. Joining a club, however, is like entering a love marriage. For here, we get to choose. That's why we all want to belong to a club. And until we find our club, our spirit is without anchor, and so we feel anxious. And the longer it takes for us to find our club, the more anxious we get. And then one day we find the club to which we must belong. And no longer do we wander aimlessly through life. We have a purpose. And though the line in front of that entrance may be long, we wait patiently, full of that special energy called gaman, forbearance. And when the club opens and then its doors open for us and our name is finally called, we enter it with pride. There is, however, one restriction on membership to my club. Only women may belong. Men say ladies cannot keep a secret, but it is the men who cannot. My club is the biggest, best-kept secret amongst all of Tokyo's secrets. Many of its own members don't even know that they've joined it. And my club may not be the oldest of Tokyo's clubs, but it's certainly the largest. None of us knows how many members it has, but I see us everywhere. In the metro, in the streets, in the banks and the government offices, and in the hospitals. How then, you might ask, do we recognize each other? I can't speak for others, but I have a gift. I can recognize my sister members at a glance. And they acknowledge me sometimes with a small knowing smile or just a raised eyebrow. Had I been someone else, I might have tried to make money with this knowledge. Banks or credit card companies would have paid me millions for what I know. But I do nothing with it, for my club's members are my sisters. I know their habits. I know what they're thinking at 6 p.m. on a Sunday night as they prepare the family dinner, or at 11 a.m. on Monday morning when they're strolling down the main avenue of Ginza, waiting for the shop girls to welcome them inside. And I know what they feel when at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in Marunouchi, they walk with bowed heads and hurried, guilty steps towards the metro. And my heart fills with pride when I see the pretty ones, so tall and slim and beautiful, their silhouettes ageless. But it is the bravery of those who are tired and old, but continue to want to remain young, that moves me to tears. What humiliations must they have suffered to remain so long in the club? Like all clubs, my club has its factions and its politics. There are two main opposing groups in my club, the housewives and the office ladies. The former have time but little money to spend, and they go to the shops and they look and look and look before they buy. They bribe the sales staff to get invited to the family sales. And they are so imaginative, so creative, and the results of their hard work so elegant that I cannot help feel proud of them. The office ladies, on the other hand, have money but no time. They work alongside men in their offices from 9 in the morning till 8 or 9 at night, only going shopping on weekends and during lunch breaks, or after work sometimes if they're lucky enough to finish before the shops close. They complain a lot, the way younger sisters do. But actually, these women are little girls. They don't want to grow up, they cannot cook. They buy a lot of rubbish, frilly dresses and flowery blouses. Flowers decorate their bags and scarves, and they love to accessorize. Computers and mobile telephones glitter, keys jangle, and even their nails are encrusted with jewels. They like to think that they can steal the love of our men, but they're wrong. Our men are already sold. The company has their love. And the only place they have left for an office lady is in their ego. If she knows how to look after it well, she'll hold on to him. If not, she will lose him. You can call my club the Beauty Lovers Club, but we aren't lovers of someone else's beauty. We do not chase beautiful things or fill our homes with pretty, useless stuff. We don't walk miles to see a beautiful view or a rare bird or to pay ridiculous prices to hear beautiful music. This is because we don't covet the beauty created by others. We want to create our own kind of beauty and do it on ourselves. And the beauty we make is not static or passive, for we make and remake it every day. And we are the true aesthetes, for we carry our beauty on our bodies. And even if our homes are old and crumbling, and the walls stink of old age and weariness, when we step out after our morning toilet, we are young and fresh and gorgeous, and our clothes and makeup are perfect.
A very beautiful passage and a teaser, in fact. Now one is tempted to take up the book. And with us is the youngest of our participants today, Gayatri Bala. Gayatri Bala is a very well-known young poet and fiction writer of Odisha. And she has won several awards at a very young age. Gayatri, मुझे पता है आप कहानी तो लाई नहीं, आप हमें अपनी एक कविता सुना दें, फिर बातचीत में कहानी और कविता दोनों पर बात करेंगे, because it has to be in translation in Hindi or English, whichever. English.
Between word and meaning, only a woman can turn into a pretty long stretch of longing. She digs into herself, sows seeds, harvests crop, makes the earth evergreen. And all her life, she sits under the shadow of one or the other, waits without end to become human. Another poem is Konarka. One says, standing still in one posture, year after year, without any movement, that is our uniqueness, that is the novelty. A few other voices join in, our nudity is our protestation. After turning to stone, having experienced delight upon delight, billows upon billows, it is the excuse for wonder for the wayfarer and for the tourist. Is Konarka a temporal fragment made in equal measure of abundance and remorse? Time has no answers.
One more, I can see one, books.
Yeah, books. She opens and closes herself like a book, according to her man's whims. Like a book, the man swims every page, and stopping where his mind says, he scans the page. When it becomes overwhelmed and tired, he pushes them to one corner and snores in happiness.
Very nice. ओडिया में भी थोड़ी सी पढ़ के सुना.
ମନ୍ଦିର ଘଣ୍ଟି ବାଜିଲେ ଦୁଲୁକି ଉଠେ ଛାତି ଛାତି ଦୁଲୁକି ଉଠିଲେ ମଣିଷର କ'ଣ ନିଦରୁ ଉଠି ପଡ଼ନ୍ତି ଈଶ୍ୱର? ଛାତି ଦୁଲକି ଉଠିଲେ କେବଳ ଚମକି ପଡ଼େ ମଣିଷ, ଆଖି ବୁଜାଏ, ଗୁଣଗୁଣାଏ, ଗୁହାରି କରେ, ଯୋଡ଼ି ହସ୍ତରେ ଛିଡ଼ା ରହେ, କାଳ କାଳ ସମ୍ଭ୍ରମ ଓ ସ୍ଥିର। ଈଶ୍ୱର ନିର୍ବିକାର। ଘଣ୍ଟି ବାଜିଲେ ମଣିଷର ନିଜକୁ ବାଢ଼ି ଦେବାର ଇଚ୍ଛା ପ୍ରବଳ ପ୍ରବଳତର। ଈଶ୍ୱର ଭୋଗଡାଲାର ସେ ନିର୍ଦ୍ଦିଷ୍ଟ ସ୍ୱାଦିଷ୍ଟ ଫଳ, ଲୋଭନୀୟ गर्भगृहर विवाक अंधार।
गीता, मैं आपसे पूछना चाहूँगी, आप कविता भी लिखती हैं और कहानी और आपने नॉवल भी लिखा है, ये दोनों अनुभव कैसे हैं, कविता लिखने का और कहानी कहने का?
कविता एक स्पॉन्टेनियस आउटपुट है, मैंने जो हठात तुरंत आता है और फिर हम लिख देते हैं, एक लाइन आता है और हम उसको जट डाउन कर लेते हैं। लेकिन जब कहानी लिखते हैं तो वो प्लॉट बहुत दिनों से हमारा माइंड में चलता रहता है और कभी उसका एक लाइन हमको तुरंत आ जाता है तो हम एक ही फ्लो में उसको कंप्लीट कर लेते हैं। लेकिन कविता के बारे में, कविता एनी टाइम एनी लाइन से शुरू हो जाता है और कहानी के लिए हमको तो वेट करना पड़ता है, वो फ्रेम उसको माइंड में फ्रेम करना पड़ता है और उसको टाइम भी लेता है। लेकिन कविता एक स्पॉन्टेनियस।
अपने किसी कहानी के बारे में बताएंगे कि आपने क्यों लिखी और किस तरह वो कहानी बनी?
अभी रिसेंटली मेरा एक नॉवेल पब्लिश होने जा रहा है। वो एक यंग बॉय के बारे में है वो नॉवेल, और वो यंग बॉय वो कभी ईश्वर से विश्वास नहीं रखता है, डेस्टिनी से विश्वास नहीं रखता है और वो हमेशा प्रैक्टिकल लाइफ में जीता है। लेकिन उसके वो जो जिस परिवेश में, जिस फैमिली में वो बढ़ता है, वो एक हाई मिडिल क्लास फैमिली है, लेकिन उसके बाद भी उस फैमिली में संस्कार है और उसको हमेशा वो एक ईश्वर के ऊपर एक विश्वास रखने के लिए उसको बोलते हैं। लेकिन वो लड़का जब MBA करने जाता है बाहर, एक मेट्रो में जाता है, तो उधर एक उसका जो फ्रेंड्स है, जो सराउंडिंग्स है, उसमें एक फ्रेंड के साथ उसका दुश्मनी हो जाता है और वो फ्रेंड कैसे इसको फंसा देता है एक रेप केस में और वो उसको जेल हो जाता है। वो फिर वो जेल से पैरोल में आता है और पैरोल में आके फिर गायब हो जाता है दुनिया से, कि अपने को वो प्रूफ करना चाहते हैं कि वो इनोसेंट है। लेकिन वो प्रूफ लास्ट में वो प्रूफ करता है, लेकिन इसी में उसका 17 ईयर्स चला जाता है। और वो 17 ईयर्स जिसको एक एस्ट्रोलॉजर उसको बोले थे कि तुम्हारा ये में हॉरोस्कोप में एक ऐसा पीरियड है जो 22 to 39 17 ईयर्स तुमको सैटर्न का ये आएगा और तुमको वो पीरियड बहुत प्रॉब्लम में रखेगा। तो ऐसे एक डेस्टिनी को लेकर और एक आदमी का उसको क्या फीलिंग्स है, क्या कैसा स्ट्रगल किया है वो लाइफ में, उसके बारे में उसका है।
शुक्रिया गायत्री। And now to Geeta. Geeta, we'd like you to share with the audience your journey as a storyteller and how you moved from journalism to narrative fiction and vice versa, using narrative fiction for your, true life stories.
I think it's very difficult to take journalism out of a person. I've been a journalist for a very long time. I started when I was 21 years old and now I'm an old woman. So for a really long time I have been a journalist. But the difference between journalism and fiction is journalism has to be based on fact, not on fiction. Whereas fiction can come out of your head. You can create characters and place them in whatever situations you want to. Now, even though superficially these look like two very opposing kind of places, very different places, actually what happens is journalism itself is full of stories because we are always talking to people. You're always meeting people. There are so many stories which never get told in the course of your journalistic writing, because you are so focused on the big story that the small stories often get left out. So they accumulated in a part of my mind. And at the same time, the big journalistic stories which are based on fact, but needed a different way of narration also were there, because this was again a very important thing. That for me, the most important thing is that whatever I write should communicate with my reader. I am not an academic in the first place, and I am not able to write academic books. But what I feel is the academic books are very important, and they are read by a very important set of people who would make decisions and who would be able to carry forward suggestions which are put there. But for the normal reader like me, I need something which I can just relate to very easily. So over a period of time, what has happened was that I also trained myself to write in a language which is very simple, which anybody can read and understand. And this is not as simple as it sounds, because to put complicated ideas into simple words and to convey it in a very simple manner is also very difficult. So the first challenge came when I wrote my first book, which was called Disappearing Daughters, The Tragedy of Female Feticide, which is about sex-selective abortion and the impact it has had on society. This is a very serious subject, a very tragic subject, because even today, if you look at the sex ratios in our countries, they are dropping. I wrote my book in 2007. Today, it's now 2014, and the sex ratios have gone down all over the country. That's another part of it. But to write this story, that is when I first thought of how I could narrate it in a different way. So in that book, I used what they call travel writing style. That is, I put myself into it. That is, wherever I went, what I saw, I narrated it exactly as I saw it. So Disappearing Daughter is more like a travelogue through the whole subject of sex-selective abortion. Subsequently, I started writing fiction. So I wrote 2 books of fiction. One was called The Healing, and it is about a South Indian Brahmin family living in Chennai. And I have tried to see how, over a period of 30 years, the attitude towards women changes. I mean, what could be considered in 1940s as something very unthinkable becomes much more acceptable 30 years later. So that was, and there too, I used the experiences I had as a journalist, the little stories which never got told in my main journalistic pieces, got incorporated, and so The Healing was born. Again, I wrote one more book of fiction, and this is called The Color of Gold, and this was published by HarperCollins in December last year. And this is set in Kolar Goldfields, which is a gold mining town where I grew up as a child. I went to school over there. But subsequently, as a journalist, I have written many articles about Kolar Goldfields because it has deteriorated, the mines have closed, the families have, have to find different methods of making it. It's like a ghost town today. So this has been haunting me. This ghost town has been haunting me for a while. So again, putting all the journalistic information I had, all the material I had collected, but which I could not, I wove it into a story. So it's a work of pure fiction. The people in it are all fictional, but the backdrop, the information that you get, everything is not fictional.
Thank you so much, Geeta.
This last, can I just say 2 words about, so Baby Makers is the final one, and in this, the fact, it is a work of fact and not fiction. That is, all the people in this, the protagonists are all real. It's just that the method of narration is fictional.
Thank you, Geeta. Fact and fiction woven together. And now, Radhika, please tell us what prompted you to write fiction, and what has been your experience, and how do you take up your themes?
Now, that's a very difficult question. Well, sort of my adventure with writing, I suppose, starts with reading, because I loved to read as a child. And I think that really what a book does is a fiction does, it appeals to your imagination and it kind of sets something alight in there. And so I think of it almost like a virus, that I think reading is a virus, it really is catching, and because it speaks straight into your imagination, it speaks to your heart, and so it's it's very exciting. And then I just happened to be, I never planned to be a writer. I always wanted to be a dancer.
You do
I do
dance.
dance, but I had an appendicitis operation and I almost died when I was 26. And so I was in bed with huge amounts of drugs going through me, and I wasn't allowed to go out because I was very weak and I had no resistance. So for 6 weeks I was housebound, and that's when, out of sheer boredom, I began to write what I thought was a short story, but then it just kept getting longer and longer, and became a novel. And then, so that's how it all began.
What was the first novel?
It was a novel, and it was called Smell, and it was about many things, but it was about the world of smell, and the main character in this book is a girl, Indian girl from Africa, whose father gets killed in a riot in Nairobi, and therefore she moves from Nairobi to Paris, where her uncle lives and has a small shop in one neighborhood, which had begun to be a neighborhood full of Indian shops. And it's a Gujarati family from Nairobi. And her mother, with her two brothers, goes to England to another brother. So the family is split up. And she's very upset, and she discovers that she has a sense of smell which is quite special, which is a gift. And at the same time, she also discovers that smell is a kind of a boundary that is separating her and her immigrant world of Indianness from French society. And so how she moves across this frontier is kind of what the story was about.
And what do you think, we all know, but I'd like to ask you, what do you think is the power of storytelling? Fiction, how it what is the experience it gives to a reader? I personally find that I have found reading fiction a healing process also. Like poetry, it elevates and it heals. What would you say?
Well, when I'm upset, when I'm upset or when I'm blocked, when I can't write, when I'm struggling, I read poetry. Because I think poetry and writing actually are very different. Because poetry refreshes words. I think right now we live in a world where there's a glut of words, where words are used, overused, misused, they're used to misrepresent. And at least me, I've become almost sort of allergic sometimes to words, because I think there's just too much around, and there's usually badly used. So in those moments of almost kind of feeling disgusted with words and wanting to retreat into silence, then I go for poetry, which is a funny confession from someone who writes novels. But so for me, poetry actually moves me more. It really refreshes my brain. Whereas a novel does something different. It moves you away from, it transports you to another reality. And then, of course, I do think that it does this business of tickling your own imagination, which is also good. I read a lot of novels.
Thank you so much, Radhika. And now on to the audience for questions.
Hello, ma'am. Throughout these sessions, we've heard that we've been simplifying English and telling us stories in a more simpler manner, which is correct. But do you feel that by simplifying to attract the Indian reader, are we compromising with the artistic value of a story?
I only said simplify. I didn't say that we have to use bad English or that you have to make it crude or anything. But what I'm saying is simple, communicating in simple language without using very complicated. I personally don't like to go and refer to the dictionary whenever I'm reading a book. So that's what I meant by saying simplify. Both the thought, simplifying the thought process. It doesn't mean that you cannot use beautiful language, correct language. But what I'm saying is the archaic way of talking. Now, even if you were to go now and pick up Charles Dickens, you would find it very difficult to read because the language itself is so different. So the modern method of communication is different. So by simplifying, I definitely am against the books which use bad English or which do not bother about style or this thing, though they may be very big bestsellers, but still to me, as a student of literature and as a writer, they are very upsetting. But I am all for simple and effective communication. Yeah.
Actually, yes. I think style, technique, and language, three are equally important for writing a story. And for writing a story, what the character demands, we generally use that type of language. May it be simple, may it be hard, but according to the character, we have to use the language.
I have a question for the panel. I was reading Radhika ma'am's sort of something written about Radhika ma'am's work, that after Ruskin born, she's one of the only people who's written English so beautifully. And it's one of the reviews. And it made me thinking that when we go to the bookstall, we have so many English authors, Indian authors writing in English. Why is it that we are compromising ourselves? Again, coming back to the same question, that we don't have to simplify it. It doesn't mean to not write beautifully. But why is that happening, that the world assumes that only a few can do it? Or are the other writers just taking a shortcut?
I'd like to add one thing here. Be it English or Hindi or Urdu, you know, when you're writing for a larger audience, and the better that you know the language, the simpler and more lucid and more communicative you get. In fact, using too many big words or complicated phrases is often when you are not very comfortable with the language. I had a friend in journalism, very celebrated editor, I won't name him, but when he was a young man and writing his report, he'd keep a dictionary open to choose the more difficult word. You know, you think you're trying to impress the reader, but whereas it should reach the reader, that is there. Anyone else? Yes, please.
I have a question for Radhika, and I read your book on Lanterns on the Home, which I loved. I want to ask a question. You are Indian, but you lived in other countries, and you have traveled, experienced other culture. What's that impact on your writing? And also, have you written characters that are not Indian?
Yes, I have. In fact, right from my very first book, I was writing characters which were not Indian. It is, and this book, My Beautiful Shadow, the main character, her name is Kayo, and she is definitely not Indian, she's Japanese. And I think every time I do that, it's quite scary for me, for two reasons. One reason is I think there is there is this thing in English which is, now of course it's changed, but when I wrote my first book, there was definitely this idea that, if you're writing English, you have to be English, or if not, you can kind of write about English if you're writing about your world. And so I thought this was very unfair. And so I decided to set and especially I thought it was unfair for two reasons. Again, but firstly, because I think it is it's the leftover of a colonial mentality, and it's something that everybody buys into even today. For example, this book is still not published in England. It's published in Russia, France, Italy, and Portugal. And the reason it's not published in England and America is because every time I have an agent, my agent approaches people, they say, why should we read a book by an Indian written about a Japanese in a Japanese voice? The same thing happened with my very first book. It did finally get published in England and America, but it took a long time for exactly the same reason, and the response was exactly the same. So in a sense, nothing has changed. I've been writing for 14 years, and nothing has changed. So I keep struggling against that. But on the other hand, for me as a reader, I've always loved reading books about other places. So, and I feel I could identify with Gabriel Garcia Marquez. All Indians who read have read books by people from other countries. I read a lot of Chinese authors, you included. And I've read Russian authors. We all have. And where is the problem?
I'd like to add one thing about Marquez. You see, Malayalam has a very vibrant culture of publishing, and they translate very fast. A book comes out and it comes out in Malayalam. So there is this well-known Malayali writer, N.S. Madhavan. Two characters are talking, and one is telling the other, don't you know, Gabriel Garcia Marquez is a Malayali writer. So
Excuse me, ma'am. This side. Okay. I have a question particularly for you. You said that you're trying to keep the language English simpler so that people can understand the idea. Now, Ruskin Bond's English and Radhika Mayam's English, they can be understood with a lot of clarity. Okay? And when you're talking about simpler English, nowadays the books that are coming with really grammatically and very bad English, and they have a more mass appeal.
no, I'm not referring to them at all. I consider Radhika's and Ruskin Bond's English simple.
Simpler.
The others are trash. You can't even read them. These are lucid and simple. The rest is trash. And writing bad English, writing no tense. In fact, it's very funny because in many of the Indian languages, we don't have the article, the. So we find sometimes, people writing, dog is going there, snake is angry. So I don't know, that is not
Somehow,
part of
don't
the
you think it is corrupting the entire idea of literature, the crap books in grammatically incorrect English that we are having?
Yeah,
right
that
now?
is...
And as writers, don't you think that this should be done something towards it?
there's nothing you can do but not read it.
The books
That
will
is the
collapse on
best.
their own after some time.
Not read it at all.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Any other question?
I would just like to say one other thing.
Question to all three of you, because you three are writers. What are the challenges you face before your book gets published, and how long does it take for you right from starting the book till it gets published?
Yes. As I am a regional writer writing in Odia, my mother tongue, still now I am not facing any problem to my books get published. It is easy for me, and I easily published till now.
Okay.
For my very first book, to get a publisher, I hunted for several years. It was a work of fiction, and I really got a lot of reject letters, and I was getting quite depressed. But fortunately, journalism hardens you a lot because you're used to getting rejects from editors also. So I was quite hardened in that way. But what happened was I got an offer from Penguin to write a book based on my journalistic experiences. And that was a commissioned book. Therefore, it was easier to write because I was not writing in blank space. I knew that it's going to get published. So I wrote that book quite fast. It took about 1 or 2 years, and it was published also quite fast by Penguin. And somehow that opened the gate for me. And after that, even the fiction book which got rejected got accepted. And since subsequently all my books have been commissioned, and therefore I have not found it difficult. And I've had 2 excellent publishers One was Penguin, and now HarperCollins. I have absolutely no problem. I just pitch the idea, and it gets accepted, and it gets published. And it takes for me to write, it takes 3 years, or 2 years to 3 years. But that is my problem, not the problem of the publisher. But to break in, I can tell you it was very difficult.
For me, it was also very difficult, but I think to break in any time, it's really very hard, unless you are lucky enough to maybe have a parent who's already writing or something. But otherwise, you have to struggle. I was lucky in the sense that I had given I never offered to, I never work with an idea and then get a commission and then work like that. I just write my thing quietly, because when I start writing, I don't even know if I'll be able to finish the book, because I don't know what's going to happen at the end very often. So it's one day at a time. I see what's going to happen. And especially each book is so different from the other that they're a challenge for me. So I don't know if I'll be able to even pull it off. And after I finish doing the manuscript, I give it to friends. So there are about 8 or 10 friends, or sometimes even people I don't know very well, but who I just feel connected. I feel this one should read this. And because they're not connected to me, they will be maybe more honest than someone who is close. So you try to find an honest reader. I get the opinions. Then I rework the text based on what they say they didn't understand. And then after that, I send it out to publishers. Now I'm lucky I have an agent. The first book, again, because I sent it to friends, I got a godfather through this circle of friends who passed it on to David Davidar at Penguin. So that's how it happened. You need godfathers in this business. Or godmothers also.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, dear panelists. I request you to please sign the BLF wall. Since this edition of BLF is dedicated to the memory of late Dr. U.R. Ananta Murthy, do visit photo exhibition on him. It's near the cafeteria. We would also like to inform you all that customized BLF t-shirts and bags are being sold near the help desk. So do proceed for that. The people who want to get their books signed, please move towards the book signing area, which is behind help desk. Thank you.